Good morning. I'm Sandy Farlow, a member of the worship team. Welcome to Community Unitarian Universalist Church. Welcome to those seated here and to those who are watching us on one of our online platforms. Our mission here at Community Church is to nourish spirits, work for justice, and transform lives. So tomorrow is an unusual day. It's an event that happens once every 4 years, but a similar occasion hasn't happened since 1893 when Grover Cleveland returned to the presidency. We might have liked him better. This is an unusual story. The stories that we hear and tell ourselves and others are powerful. They can scare us to prevent us from moving forward. They can make us sad to call forth our empathy, or they can inspire us to action. We will need strength, resilience, truth, and hope to hear and play our parts in the stories to come over the next few years. Good stories reinforce our resolve. Bill Holston is here this morning to share a story about John Lewis and his own life. We're always pleased to have a good man in the pulpit. So, welcome, Bill. These words are by Krista Tippett. Enough of us across all our differences see that we have a world to remake. We want to orient towards that possibility. We want to meet what is hard and hurting. We want to rise to what is beautiful and life-giving. We want to do that where we live, and we want to do it walking alongside others.
From Across That Bridge by John Lewis. You are a light. You are the light. Never let anyone, any person, or any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light. Shine like a beacon for all to see.
What does it mean to be human? How do we want to live? Who will we be to each other? Please join me now as we say our covenant, the promise we make in this world. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help one another. On Being began as a weekly national public radio show, pitched, piloted, and hosted by Krista Tippett. We read her words at the opening of our service today. She's a Peabody Award-winning broadcaster, a National Humanities Medalist, a New York Times best-selling author. She grew up in a small town in Oklahoma and attended Brown University and Yale Divinity School and became a journalist and a diplomat in Cold War Berlin. Because people connected with her idea that intelligent public conversation about the religious, spiritual, and moral aspects of human life are indeed welcome in an increasingly divided society, the radio show became a podcast, and then the Civil Conversations Project, and eventually with her partner Lucas Johnston, became the On Being Project. This responsive reading is an adaptation of their whys for that project, and I believe it's a statement about us and where we would like to be as well. Please join me, your words are on the screen. We seek human wholeness, the life of the mind, the truth of the body, the wild mystery of the human spirit, and our need for each other. We elevate voices of wisdom and models of wise thinking We practice moral imagination. We embrace paradoxical curiosity. We sit with conflict and complexity. We endeavor to make goodness and complexity riveting. We see beauty as a core moral value and a feature of vitality. We know joy to be life-giving, resilience making human birthright. We meet longings for justice and healing by equipping ourselves for reflection, repair, and joy. We believe that whole spiritual inquiry propels us outside the boundaries of self into the world. We nurture virtues as moral muscle memory towards sustained new realities, including words that matter, hospitality, generous listening, humility, patience, adventurous civility. We honor poets and poetry as necessary companions to reach across the mystery of ourselves and the mystery of each other. We understand love as the most reliably transformative muscle of human wholeness, and we investigate the workings of love as a public practice. We envision a world that is more fluent in its own humanity, and thus able to rise to the great challenges and promise of this century. Thank you.
I was born in 1956 in Mobile, Alabama, which was the last year of the Montgomery bus boycott. Not that I ever learned anything about that growing up. No one I know mourned the death of Dr. King when he was murdered, because I lived in a segregated home, a segregated city, immersed in white nationalism, white supremacy. And so as we celebrate Dr. King's birthday, it's important to remember that he was reviled in much of the country, and that's what resulted in his death, because he stood up for truth and justice and love. Well, I was not taught an accurate version of history growing up. I was taught the myth of the lost cause. I was taught a sanitized white nationalist history. Oh, that was so long ago, because now we've learned from those lessons, haven't we? And there's no longer any efforts to suppress an accurate teaching of history. Well, of course, there is a huge effort to suppress the truth of history. It will lose, because even that young boy that I was in Alabama could go to libraries and get books and read Dr. King's works, even if it was discouraged by my parents or my school. And I'm continuing that journey, as most of us, all of us are really, in learning accurate history. This year I read this biography of John Lewis. It's the newest biography of him by David Greenberg. It's quite good. I just finished it. And so as we reflect this weekend on Dr. King, as well as the beginning of this new administration, it's good to go back and listen to our elders and listen to not just the words they said, although we'll read some of those this morning, but also the life that John Lewis lived as the lesson for us and how we approach these things. Well, John Lewis was born in 1940 in Pike County, Alabama, in the Jim Crow segregated South. He was denied access to the local public library, which was segregated. His parents had 10 children. In 1957, he left home to study at American Baptist Theological Seminary, where he wanted to study to be a preacher. But events from the civil rights movement that were blossoming in Nashville, where he went to school, intervened. In 1959, he started going to trainings put on by pacifist James Lawson. who had been imprisoned as a conscientious objector during the Korean War. And so John Lewis began learning about Gandhi. He learned about abolitionist, Unitarian Aden Ballou. And he was soon, as a young man, participating in sit-ins and was arrested for the first time. He became completely converted to the philosophy of nonviolence, this concept of satyagraha. And that term, if you've studied Dr. King, you've heard that. It's a compound of two Sanskrit words, meaning truth and to hold on, or to hold on to the truth. And so the idea of truth pervades this idea of nonviolent and nonviolent resistance to oppression that Dr. King preached and that John Lewis subscribed to his entire life with more zeal than most other civil rights activists. His actions were part of changing our country. And many of us hoped that that change was going to become permanent, although we have learned that it is not. It is always something we have to fight for. Over his lifetime, John Lewis was arrested 40 times. Several of those events happened while he was a United States congressman. So he continued this activism his entire life, which is really important to note. He was friends with people that risked their lives, friends of people who lost their lives fighting for voting rights in Alabama, because it was quite dangerous to fight for voting rights in Alabama when he was doing that. He said about that time, "My soul became satisfied that I was right in what I was doing. I could no longer be satisfied of going along with an evil system that I had to be maladjusted to." John Lewis participated in, there were two different events of the freedom rides, these desegregation of trans-state or interstate bus travel. In Montgomery, Alabama, he was beaten almost to unconsciousness. And of course, buses were burned, people were attacked, people were injured, people were put in the hospital. And he participated in both wings of that. At 23 years old, he was the youngest person to stand on the platform with Dr. King at the March of Washington in D.C. And there he spoke, and it's interesting to note, they edited his words. He wanted his words to be more radical than they wound up being, and so the activists edited out some of his language, but this is what he did say. He said, "We will march with the spirit of love and with the spirit of dignity that we have shown here today. By the force of our demands, our determination, and our numbers, we will splinter the segregated South into 1,000 pieces and put them together in the image of God and democracy. We must say, wake up, America, wake up, for we cannot stop and we will not and cannot be," I love this, "patient." And he didn't stop. He continued his activism for voting rights, particularly in the later in many different ways, but eventually in the Carter administration working for voting rights. Then he ran for United States congressman, a very contentious election against Julian Bond, and he was elected a United States congressman in 1986. And I love this. There were things I thought I knew about John Lewis, but I learned a lot from this book. So the two different confirmations of Supreme Court justices, he was in the House of Representatives, not the Senate. So he didn't get to vote on the confirmation of Clarence Thomas or John Roberts, but he testified as a witness in both, drawing on his experience working for voting rights in Alabama. And so he testified against Clarence Thomas being confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. And then at the 40th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, it's important to note, signed by a Texan, Lyndon Baines Johnson. At the 40th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, he testified against the nomination of John Roberts. And he said this: John Roberts' memos reveal him to be hostile towards civil rights, affirmative action, and the Voting Rights Act. And that turned out to be prescient, because John Roberts signed the opinion in Shelby versus Holder, which was part of dismantling that Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which people died in order to make happen. And so he was right. That was a turn to the worse in our Supreme Court, and a turn back from the voting rights that, as I said, people died for. And he said, John Lewis said, and if you told me all these years later that we would still be fighting for voting rights, I wouldn't have believed you. Now, for the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington in 2013, he said this: I thought we had completed the fight for the right to vote, the right to participate in the democratic process. I thought we were in a process of reforming the justice system. But when I see something like what the Supreme Court did in Shelby versus Holder, or what happened to Trayvon Martin, it tells me over and over again that we're not there yet. We have not finished. And of course, that's still true. Now, he said this, and he drew on those experiences of his arrests and his protests over and over the course of his career, and drawing on that and pointing it out in the context of continuing to fight for civil rights and voting rights. And so he said, I got arrested 40 times during the 60s. Speaking at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he said, beaten and left bloody and unconscious. And I love this, but I'm not tired. I'm not weary. I'm not prepared to sit down and give up. I am ready to fight and to continue fight, and you must fight. Now, the defining moment of his life was really that march across Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. How many people have walked across Edmund Pettus Bridge? Yeah, I really urge you to do it. A few years ago, my wife and I did a civil rights tour through the South, and we went to Montgomery to the Legacy Museum and the Memorial to Peace and Justice. And we drove through Selma and we walked across that bridge. It's a very, very traumatic place, and the photos don't really show you that it's really on an incline. So they were walking up a hill into state troopers who laid into them with batons and beat those people. And they tried 3 times. They turned around twice. It was only the 3rd time that they finally made it across that bridge. Now, Selma is in Dallas County, Alabama. My great-great-grandfather, Tillman C. Holston, lived in Selma, lived in Dallas County, Alabama. And so Selma has a piece of my own family history. I'm sure, I don't know this for a fact, but the chances of this are 99.9% that they were white nationalists and espousing the persecution of the black people who lived in Dallas County, Alabama. I'm sure my ancestors were involved in that. Because I think they would have remembered if they hadn't been. I think we would have pointed that out. Now, because of his efforts there to register voters in Dallas County, he was arrested 5 times in Selma just during that voting rights demonstration. And so on that day that I mentioned a minute ago, where they finally crossed the bridge and the state troopers laid into them with batons, that became known as Bloody Sunday because of and that played out on television, and it worked out strategically well for civil rights fight because it laid bare it made obvious how oppressive and violent and brutal the efforts to suppress the vote was. And that was one of the reasons we were able to get a Voting Rights Act through Congress by LBJ. And that moment, I think, came to define his life I think John Lewis, it inspired him through the rest of his life to be an activist because he knew the price he had paid and others he knew and loved paid for those rights. Now, during the Obama administration, of course, many of us, we remember that, remember how hopeful we were about what it meant that we had elected a black president in the United States. But then it's easy to forget, well, maybe not so easy to forget, that this was also the birth of the Tea Party and the huge backlash of prejudice that resulted because of that. And so during the fight for the Affordable Care Act, John Lewis was a congressman, and he said they walked through crowds of people yelling racial epithets at them, yelling racial epithets at a United States congressman. And he said, they were shouting, but it's okay. We faced that before. People yelled at us. They threw things at us. And we were able to proceed in a nonviolent way. John Lewis remained committed to nonviolence his entire life and to love and building what he and Dr. King called the beloved community. And he said about that fight for the Affordable Care Act, he said, on a Sunday like this, he had marched for voting rights. And he said it took a lot to walk across that bridge, but we knew what we were walking for. In this caucus today, we know what we're fighting for. So let's lock arms and pass health care for the American people. And they did. And they walked across and passed the Affordable Care Act, which has benefited Americans ever since then. Even people who voted against it now celebrate the Affordable Care Act because it is fundamental, and he knew that. Now, I mentioned, and it's very easy to glorify this, but not really reflect on how remarkable this was. John Lewis was committed, as I said, to nonviolence. He was committed to love. He met with George Wallace, who was the segregationist governor of Alabama, who expressed regret for his actions during the Civil Rights Movement. John Lewis met with the white former mayor of Selma, who also expressed regret for the things he had done during the Civil Rights Movement. And John Lewis forgave them and expressed love and forgiveness to these people who had been a part of physically harming him in really violent ways. So he said most famously the idea, because he understood how hard this fight was. And so he said to people, do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It's a struggle of a lifetime. And then he said, never be afraid to make
good trouble.
Very good. Good trouble. A quote I spoke to SMU Law School this week, and I told those first-year law students that quote. They said, do you have any advice? And I went, yes, don't be afraid of being in good trouble. I'm not sure they're going to invite me back, but we'll see. But one of the lessons, I think this is the biggest takeaway of the life of John Lewis, is don't ever stop. Don't stop until the end of your life. And he illustrates this great quote from Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright, who said, there are those who struggle for a day, and they're good. And there are those who struggle for a year, and they're better. And there are those who struggle all their lives. They are the indispensable ones. John Lewis was one of the indispensable ones, as we can be too. Now, I love this illustration from the life of John Lewis, where they were in Congress responding to yet another shooting, mass shooting, the one at the Pulse nightclub, where someone who had espoused himself to be a follower of ISIS went and shot up a gay nightclub in Florida. And so Democrats in Congress said, we need to do something, which they had said often in response to many things. And of course, Congress did nothing. And so they were trying to decide, okay, what do we do? And so they were desperate to make some headway, and it says they rallied behind a bill they called No Fly, No Buy, which would prevent people on the government's list of terror suspects from buying guns, and a second bill mandating background checks. And it didn't go anywhere. And so on June 21st, the Democratic caucus held another meeting, and they rolled out, they debated a few different ideas. What can we do to make a point about maybe making a change? And so finally, Lewis said, maybe we should sit down. And everyone said, oh, yeah. And so they were going to annex this struggle to the sit-ins that they did during the Civil Rights Movement. But now these were United States congressmen that were going to do that. So at 11 o'clock that morning, Lewis claimed the podium in Congress, and they did this secretly. This was opposed by the Democratic leadership even. These were individual congressmen going to engage in acts of civil disobedience on the floor of Congress. And so he wore a dark suit, a rainbow gay pride ribbon in support of the Pulse victims, and he said, Mr. Speaker, I ask that all of my colleagues join me on the floor. And with that, 26 members walked forward, stood with him, and he said, we have lost hundreds of thousands of innocent people to gun violence. And what has this body done, Mr. Speaker? Nothing, not one thing. And then they started chanting, give us the vote. And it says, Lewis stepped forward and bent on one knee. He settled his 76-year-old body onto the blue carpeting in order to make a point. Now, the end of that story is we passed meaningful gun reform, right? No, we did not. It did not change anything other than he stood for truth. He put his body on the line once again, and that's the point. The point is not whether we win or not. It is we stand for truth, or in this case, we kneel for truth, whether or not it impacts anything. And that was one of the big lessons of his life, because they said, one of the congressmen looked at Kevin McCarthy and said, we need to stop this. You could have him carried off the floor. We only need to call the Capitol Police. Kevin McCarthy looked and said, I'm going to have John Lewis carried off of the floor. Are you crazy? And so they were there for another 24 hours sitting in Congress until they eventually turned off the heat to the Capitol. And finally, they ended their protest. But this is such a, beautiful illustration of a man who had power, lots of power, and he was still putting his body on the line. So there's a couple other things I want to talk about, and then we'll go on and leave here and fight for justice. First was a column I saw. It was actually a book review in Dallas Morning News, a book, Masters of Change by Brad Stulberg. And he talked about this idea of tragic optimism, which was a term coined by Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, who wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. And it talks about the difference of excessive optimism and delusion, or extreme pessimism and despair, those two poles. And in the book, he says, between these two poles, there's a third way, committing to wise hope and wise action. Wise hope and wise action asked us to accept a situation, see it clearly for what it is, and then muster the strength, courage, and resolve to focus on what we can control. We remind ourselves that we have faced challenges before. We continue because to stand still is not an option. And so at this moment, at a moment when it can seem that all is lost, we be wise to embrace tragic optimism, wise hope, wise action. And in this, we can recognize that we can exert our agency, even if limitedly, even if only in increments. However we can, these attitudes and skills and our willingness to adapt and practice them are essential to not only our individual resilience, but that of our communities. We need both now. I have a question. How many of you are tired? Yeah. How many of you look at another 4 years of the Trump administration and our Texas legislature committed to fascism? How many of you are fatigued by that? I am. I know I am. But that's why words like this guide us, because it's acknowledging that. It doesn't do us any good to say, look, you're not tired, are you? Well, we are tired. Or, it's going to be better. Well, I'm 68 years old. I think that our state will not be better in my lifetime. I think it is very likely that it will not. But that didn't stop John Lewis in 1965. Think of the odds those people faced in Selma, Alabama. They were tremendous odds. Did they deny those odds? No. They did. Diane Nash and the other activists on those bus rides, they wrote out their wills. Okay? They knew what the risks are, and guess what? They did it anyway. And that's us. We acknowledge the reality of what we face. We acknowledge that our Texas legislator is not likely to listen to reasonable voices because they're fascists. Donald Trump is not likely to back away from his promise of mass deportations because he's put Stephen Miller in charge. Stephen Miller is a white national. He has told us what he is committed to doing, and I hope he doesn't. I seriously do. I hope he does not. But I plan on that he does do what he said he's going to do. And in response to that, we understand the reality of it. We accept it. We know that our efforts might be futile. They might be limited, but we act anyway because we are doing that because I am convinced, my children are in the 30s, that this world will be a better world for them. I am committed to that. And so was John Lewis. And he showed that till the very end. My favorite picture of him is actually one of him looking over the Black Lives Matter painting on the streets of Washington. This was at the very end of his life. And he went down to see that, went to the hospital right afterwards. And these are his last words he wrote. And he was addressing those to those activists, these young people. And he said, like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said, we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said, it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said, each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something, you must do something. Democracy is not a state, it is an act. And each generation must do its part to help build what he called the beloved community. And then he ended this to say, so I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. May it be so.
Our benediction today are the words of John Lewis. I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. If you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something about it. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get into good trouble. Amen.